Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australian Institute podcast where we're talking about just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Elinor Johnston-Leake, the senior content producer here at the Australian Institute, and as always, I'm talking to our chief economist, Greg Jericho. Hello, Greg.
Hi, Elinor, and welcome to 2025, your first podcast of the year.
Yes, not the first podcast, but my first. Huge thanks to Adam for taking over from me last week.
Yep, Adam did a great job.
He did, yep.
We were going to contemplate replacing you, Pep. No.
Unfortunately,
never
you
do
can't.
That.
Yes.
No.
So, Greg, this year is actually not off to a great start as a whole. It's off to a bit of a foreboding start, really. I don't know if you've seen in the news the huge wildfires in LA.
In Southern California, firefighters are bracing for another tough day of weather conditions as they continue to battle deadly wildfires that have now claimed the lives of at least 25 people.
New danger tonight, in fact, as Los Angeles County declares a public health emergency, warning that smoke and debris could pose immediate and long-term threat.
At least 25 people have been killed and dozens are still missing.
Investigators are trying to get to the bottom of the question that's on everyone's mind. How did all of this happen? What started the two most destructive fires in Southern California history?
So, Greg, 2024 was also the hottest year on record, absolutely smashing the record of 2023. This is an election year in Australia, and both major parties' climate policy leave a hell of a lot to be desired, really. It's just quite putting it lightly. And the last federal election was hailed by quite a few people, including some of us here at the Australian Institute, as something of a climate election. And obviously, that didn't really go quite where we wanted it to. So, Greg, in the lead up to the next election, is anything different this time?
Yeah, you're right, Elinor. 2025, not a great start on a number of fronts, and especially with what we're talking about today, climate. And I think the really kind of tragic thing about it, and this is why I had a bit of a rant this week in my column, was that for Australians looking over at Americans, seeing what's happened in LA, there's a hell of a lot of deja vu. It really brings back the 2019-20.
Seeing people handing out N95 masks, the smoke in the sky,
And also the obfuscation, lies and misleading statements by politicians and people in the media about what's causing the fires, the sense that, oh no, this isn't due to climate change, it's due to vandals, or oh, there wasn't enough water in the whereas it was.
Wokeism somehow?
Yeah. Oh, there's these DEI hires because the LA Fire Department cares about diversity. That's why they can't control these massive wildfires with 100-mile-per-hour winds that apparently, if it was all just white men, they'd be able to bring it under control. So I was sort of looking at this and going, I've seen this movie before.
Yep.
Not only did I see it in 2019, we saw it kind of before, even with the floods in Queensland and New South Wales, where it's never the fault of climate change. You can go back even to the Victorian bushfires in 2008. And again, it was back then Bob Brown was absolutely vilified for suggesting there was a link between the fires and climate change. And his suggestion back then that climate change was going to produce more and worse bushfires. And there was a sense of, how dare you politicize this debate? And so I was looking at this and going, oh my God, here we are, kind of where we were before the last election, before the election before that. We've come off the hottest year on record. We got these massive bushfires. We're 5 months at most from an election. And what the hell is going on with climate change policy in Australia? And it's like, I looked and go, it's just a farce. It's it's nothing. And you're right about the last election. The last election, again, we were thinking, right, this is going to be a climate change election. And it kind of was and it wasn't. The Liberal Party were in complete denial, literally, of climate change. You had their idiotic targets at 24%. You had Scott Morrison, Mr. This is coal. Don't be scared of it. You had Labor, however, being really wimpy. They backtracked on their targets at the 2019 election from 55% cuts. They went down to 43% cut, which was, I'm pretty sure it was just they drew a line from where it was in 2022 to net zero in 2050, and it kind of arrived at 43%. Pretty much. That was kind of the maths involved. And it was all kind of pathetic, really. And during the election campaign, it was not an issue. There was no sense from Labor going, we want this to be an issue. And yet, ironically, it was a climate change election because of what happened with all the Teals and the Independents, who very much were running on the line that the Liberal Party, if you actually are serious about climate change, you believe the science, agree with the science, you can't vote for the Liberal Party. Vote for us.
And a lot of people did.
And unfortunately, though, because the two major parties weren't really doing anything other than, we'll get some renewables and our cuts are bigger than your cuts, but, we'll all be offsetting it all and everything. Not a lot has happened in the past 3 years, including cuts to emissions. Emissions have, if anything, risen a little bit since the last election. They're basically where they were at the end of the pandemic. The government's forecasts are for them to be exactly where they are now until the end of 2027, at which point they magically start going down on a straight line to getting to 43% cut by 2030. It's rather magical.
We'll be good later.
It'll be great. So it's all kind of a bit depressing, and that's why I kind of had a bit of a rant.
Yeah. And I'd like to quote a little bit from your rant from the column. In the run-up to the 2019 election, I argued that the coalition isn't being honest about the climate crisis, but neither is Labor. But by the 2022 election, that at least seemed preferable to the deafening silence on the issue. So has anything changed in that regard? Is either party being honest?
No, not at all. I don't think the Liberal Party are honest. I don't think the Labor Party are honest. They're dishonest in different ways. And I put in my column, and I say here that the Liberal Party are dishonest. They're lying about what needs to be, that anything really needs to be done. And they're certainly obviously talking about nuclear, and we'll get to nuclear in a sec. The Labor Party are lying that in what I think has been the biggest problem with the Labor Party over the past 20 years about climate change is this sense that we know it is this massive, once in maybe 200-year kind of shift in the economy, as big a shift as in the economy as anyone would have seen since the Industrial Revolution. Huge upheaval of the whole basis of our economy and parts of our society. And the Labor Party are like, well, if we just have this nice middle-of-the-road cut and we have some offsets, no pain, it'll all be done. We just need to tweak it a little bit. And it's like, you can't on one hand say that this is this massive thing that it's urgent. This is
an existential
threat. And then, but don't worry, it's not really going to change your life at all.
There's a middle ground here.
Yeah, and there is no sense at all over the past 3 years that anyone would have been looking at what the Labor Party have gone, whoa.
That'll do it.
That's big. At no point would you thought, Jesus, they are really going for it. Instead,
ambitious.
It's all, we'll just it's all blah, blah,
it's all
nothing.
Not as bad as the coalition.
And so to my mind, that's kind of a bit of an insidious lie. It's this lie that, we're doing something and we really care about it, but don't worry, it's not, the fix actually is little. It's like saying you have got a massive health issue and you probably will die in 6 months if you don't do anything. But the good thing is we've got some Panadol.
Yeah.
And all
you don't have to change any of your
habits.
Your
Keep
lifestyle.
smoking.
Yeah.
We'll get someone else to stop smoking, and that offsets your smoking, and it's all great.
It'll all be fine.
So there's that lie, but also it's got worse because the Liberal Party have basically worked out last time. They lost because they had Scott Morrison and a party room full of deniers of climate change is basically a bit of a nothing. It's a myth. It doesn't really exist. We can keep pumping out coal and gas and everything's great. The Liberal Party worked out, that's not a good policy to take to an election. So what they've done is they've come up with nuclear power.
Yes, it's been thrust onto the agenda with all the grace of, I don't know, someone walking in a hazmat suit.
Yeah. I mean, but again, it's still a lie. It's just a bit more subtle lie in that they are pushing nuclear power to make it sound like they are taking this issue seriously. And yet it has been done in a way which anyone, and certainly we here at the Australian Institute have looked at it quite closely. Their policy is complete bunkum. It's not a policy. The numbers are all absolutely dodgy as all heck. The modelling that they put out by Frontier Economics, we've got a couple really smart guys who've worked in modelling in the past, and they looked and just like, really? They didn't even try here, Basically, they were like, oh, we'll produce less energy than the ALP's policy, and so it'll cost less. And it's like, well,
what?
Yeah, it's like saying, I spend less money at the grocery shop because I buy less groceries, and so my policy is cheaper. It's that kind of thing. And also when it comes to the issue of climate change, no one really seriously thinks that the nuclear plants are going to be developed in the time frame that the Liberal Party is suggesting. So even if you squint and pray and hope and they get done in, say, 20 years, by then that's far too late to have made any difference. And so it's really a policy that is all about just pretending that we have a policy. Chris Pine, former minister for Howard, for Abbott, for Turnbull, and Morrison. That's the only ones. He wrote a column in the 9 newspapers this week where he basically said, no one really believes this, but it's a really smart policy because by the time anyone really works out that it's not going to be delivered, the election's over and they're all safe.
And that's really what smart policy is.
Yeah, it was
That's what the point of policy is.
I would not recommend anyone read the column because it was so poorly written, or should I say poorly edited as well, because I don't think it was edited. But he's basically saying, the Liberal Party needed a credible policy, so they came up with this completely non-credible idea. And wow, that's a really good policy because it'll fool people. Yeah, and we've talked about this in the past in other podcasts that the Australian Institute have talked about it. It's all a joke, but it's this comfortable joke that both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party like.
Yeah, how do the Labor Party feel about this? Surely they're a bit happy that the Liberal Party are putting up such a load of codswallop.
What a very nice way to describe it. Yeah, look, they are and they aren't. I mean, they've had a bit of a problem in countering it because one of the problems is that the Labor Party's position on climate change for a good 30 years, maybe even 40 years really, is that it's not safe. And that's kind of worked for the last 30 years or so. And it certainly was a big winner in the 80s when everyone, you had Chernobyl, you had the 3 Mile Island, you had this sense of nuclear weapons and danger and all that thing. Now, rightly or wrongly, there is less of a concern about the safety of nuclear power. Now, certainly things like Fukushima and things like that, we know the risks and everything, but overall, most people have the sense of, well, they've been around for ages and you don't really hear too many stories about them.
Technology's improved. Yeah, we're not the Soviets. We're a little bit smarter.
Yeah, so that aspect is not cutting through so much. So they've had to really switch it to one. And the good thing for the Labor Party is they actually do have reality on their side, is that one, this technology actually is all fairy tale stuff, which is why Peter Dutton, whenever he promotes this policy, uses this lovely graphic design that looks like an entertainment park.
Yeah, it's very flat. Looks a bit like a screensaver.
Yeah, it does. A screensaver where you go for holidays and look at the nuclear power being generated. It's so wonderful.
Yeah.
And the reason they do that is because there are no actual small modular nuclear reactors anywhere. They're all in the development stage. And there will be always these nuclear bros on Twitter and like, oh no, they're getting developed somewhere in Utah, and then you find out no, they've actually cancelled those plans.
Oh, okay.
So if you really want to see one, go to Siberia and see a former nuclear powered icebreaker that has been decommissioned and hooked up to power lines.
If we have any more icebreakers lying around.
Yeah. So it's all pipe dream. Australia doesn't have the technology, doesn't have the skills, doesn't have the money really to do it because no one's going to invest in it. It will have to be government funded. It would take far too long. So the Labor Party can actually argue it's costly, it's too slow, won't solve your energy prices now. It'll solve them maybe in 2045 if we're lucky, all of that kind of stuff. So Labor Party like it in that instance because they like being able to argue just against the Libs' nuke policy because they say, oh, you're not serious, you're coming up with this idiotic policy, it's not real, it's all fake, you're not taking it seriously. And they like that because if the discussion is just about nukes, then no one's actually talking about the Labor's policy, which is not really doing anything, which is still approving coal mines approving extensions
coal mine
to coal mines.
Yes.
Oh, geez, we can't say that they're new coal mines. No, Tanya Plibersek is very
Don't
proud.
worry, they just extended out to 2050 or so.
No.
Yeah.
Tanya Plibersek very proud that Labor have not approved any new coal mines. They've just approved a heck of a lot of extensions to coal mines that had previously been approved. So that's so much better, so much nicer. So Labor are happy to talk about nukes because if you talk about nukes, they're not talking about improving coal mines. The fact that they're still wanting more and more gas in the system, that their tax system is set up to basically give gas companies whatever they want, that a lot of their targets reductions are coming from offsets, that even when you talk about their 43% cut, it's including the very dodgy land use clearing measure that basically means in real terms we've hardly cut emissions at all since 2005. All of these things.
Yeah, offsets themselves are very dodgy.
Very dodgy. The Australian Institute's done some great work. Holly Hemming done some excellent work. Stephen Long has done some really good reporting showing that there are some really bad carbon offset schemes around. And all of that criticism, all of that focus, all of that let's talk about your policy is kind of pushed away if it just becomes about nukes. And so that's kind of where we are. And it's like, okay, great. We're coming up to an election and the big climate change policy at a time when we've just come off of 2 years of record temperatures. We've got LA fires burning in the dead of winter. You know, we know Australia's climate is changing. It's all out of whack. And yet we're basically got a debate over kind of a lie of a policy that both sides know is a lie. Both sides like it because it's arguing on the terrain that they want to argue on rather than on terrain of a journalist or anyone saying, so are you actually going to rule out approving any more new coal mines, even for thermal coal, let alone metallurgical coal, which you might be able to justify on some we need steel kind of grounds. But thermal coal, the lowest hanging fruit, they won't even be able to do that. And they don't want to answer those questions. They want to talk about nukes.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of those questions, where has the media been in all of this? Do you think that the media is performing their role adequately and calling the government out on these arguments?
No, you might be shocked.
You're not counting yourself in the media in this sense?
I'm of course perfect.
Of course, yes.
Infallible. Look, I would say 90% of the media. I don't know. I haven't done the precise calculations, but let's say 90% of the media are terrible on this. Yeah, we saw in 9 newspapers a column talking about the 5 areas where the fight is going to be on climate change. And one of them was on nukes. And nowhere in that column was it pointing out that this is a crap policy that doesn't actually do it. You know, it was talking about, it's about renewables and it was about offsets and things. And at no point in any of those 5 things was it about things that will actually reduce emissions, stop fossil fuels being dug out of the ground and burnt. Nowhere was there a call for, okay, is anyone actually going to stop?
Take some real action.
It's all this faffing about over this very narrow sort of defined argument that completely misses the whole point of policy on climate change, which is about stopping emissions rising, reducing emissions, and instead it's all about how can both sides look like they're pretending to be doing something seriously, and that's where the fight on. Who is going to be the best at being able to convince voters that their policy is actually doing something, rather than the media going, neither of your policies are going to do anything.
Yeah.
And actually
telling the public
focus.
here's why.
Instead it's, oh, the politics of nuclear power is this, or the government is struggling with its offsets. There's become, because of I have to admit, because of some of the Australia Institute's really good work, there's becoming a lot of disquiet about offsets. Are they for real? Is this how it should be done? So instead of that becoming the thing and going, it's how is the government going to counter those claims? And it's
like
just
political football.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really where we're at. And it's a really sad thing because, to be honest, it was, I look back over my columns over the past, decade. And apart from changing the fact that the temperatures I'm talking about are now higher than they were back in 2016, there's not a lot I need to change in terms of policy. There's no sense that now we're actually got a serious debate. Now we're actually caring about doing something. Instead, it's still over this who can convince the voters that their inadequate policy is adequate. And that becomes the questions that the media are asking rather than pointing out you both got inadequate policies here. Look, the reason being is our media system is not set up to actually deal with these problems. We have journalists who lack the skills to be able to read policy and understand it. Unfortunately, there is a decline in resources in media. So, that's sort of a bit of an excuse. It's not an excuse. This thing has been going on for so long. If you don't know, if you can't look at nuclear power and call that out as a crap policy, time to resign and go be a consultant for a gas company or something, because you're clearly failing the public.
Yeah.
And it leaves voters, feeling very disillusioned.
Yeah. And speaking of the public, in the public trying to have their say, governments have been cracking down all over the world, but in Australia particularly, governments have been cracking down on peaceful climate protesters. So it's becoming a bit more difficult for people to take a stand publicly and have their say. But on the flip side, fossil fuel lobbyists don't seem to be having too much of a problem reaching the government. Lobbying and donations to political parties on both sides from the fossil fuel industry seems to be really as prominent as ever.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting to the point, and I don't know the precise figures, but we were sort of chatting about this in the office, that it's actually now costing more in fines if you're protesting against coal than it is costing for, say, a coal or gas company exec to buy a seat at a dinner where they'll be sitting with the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition. And yeah, of course, they would never be allowed to, if you're a protester, to buy one of those
No, of
seats.
course not.
They would be told, oh, no, you're just doing this to cause disruption. You're right. If you look at in South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, even Queensland, definitely Western Australia, everywhere, the governments have rushed through laws to prevent protests. Literally in the week that an event is happening, to prevent protesters standing out the front of, I don't know, Santos's headquarters, or to do anything that might draw attention in any way to the fact that fossil fuel is being pumped out massively and with the full backing of the government, and both parties are very much in hock to it. We know that there has been a run of ministers of resources who have left government and then gone to work in the mining industry, which, it's a shocking state of affairs that is done, and everyone's just, oh, well, that's what happens.
Yeah, it is very annoying when the climate protesters block Sydney Harbour Bridge, so therefore.
Yeah, we'll throw the book at them.
Yeah.
But when Santos are involved in an oil spill,
they get
behind
a 10 closed doors, shaking hands.
They get a 10 grand fine.
Yeah.
Is it 10 grand?
10 grand, yeah.
Yeah, a 10 grand fine.
Yeah, which costs less than a nursing degree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, our priorities are completely skewed. And this is why, last year we made a big push about the fact that the Petroleum Resources Rent Tax, which is the main tax that gas companies pay, Australians pay more in HECS than they do in the PRT. In Western Australia, gas companies pay less in royalties than Western Australian drivers pay in rego. And the reason we point out these is not just that we think they should be paying more tax, but it just highlights these are the industries that are emitting fossil fuels. They are the ones causing climate change, and yet not only is our legal system set up to ensure that there is no disruption to this, our tax system is actually actively encouraging it.
Yeah.
And then you have these political parties saying, oh, but we're really serious about climate change. We've got these targets in place. And it's like, but it's all just it's literally window dressing.
Yeah.
So we've got the tax system that is designed to actually actively promote climate change and actively promote more emissions. And at the same time, we've got governments talking even about a cost of living crisis and ignoring the fact that actually climate change is making our cost of living crisis even worse.
Yeah. Well, the Australian Institute put out some research just this week about climate change, and the natural disasters it causes are making insurance premiums more expensive across the world.
Why would fires on the other side of the world impact us here?
Now, the problem is that it's the same global capital market that pays for large-scale disasters everywhere in the world. That market's taken quite a beating year on year over the last few years, including from our floods in 2022. And it's going to take quite a beating now from these LA fires.
California residents are facing a potential insurance crisis over the wildfires. Damage is already estimated in the hundreds of billions.
The way insurance is built, the way it works, whether it's medical or home insurance, is that the losses of a few are paid by the premiums of many. So these insurance companies will spread out the cost, meaning that we all can see our home insurance rates go up because of the severity of these fires and back-to-back catastrophic disasters that we're seeing, these natural disasters more and more.
The market was already in a tough spot before this event. Like many of us, insurers have been looking out the window and seeing that wildfires are getting more frequent and more severe, and the risk has grown even compared to a decade ago. And so insurers bear the cost of repairing and replacing their policyholders' homes. So for insurers, greater risk means greater costs, which means they have to charge higher prices to stay in business.
Really comes back to the insurers of insurance companies, which we call reinsurers. They're the ones who basically insurance companies have to get insured as well. But what these reinsurers are realizing, you guys are paying out a lot more policies because of floods, because of fires, because of natural disasters that are linked with climate change. And insurance companies don't like paying out money. That is not a win for them. And so what the reinsurers are doing is they're raising their fees to insurance companies. Now, insurance companies aren't going to wear that. They pass it on to us because they know they're paying out more and more. So fine, the risk is greater. You're going to have to pay more for it. And it is abundantly clear that is happening worldwide. The LA fires, these massive reinsurance companies, there's only a couple around in the world. So things that happen in America, things that happen in Australia, things that happen in Europe affect everyone else around the world. And because the reinsurance companies aren't going to say, oh, well, that was just a localized LA thing. They're going, yeah, that's going to happen everywhere. It's costing us money. You guys in every country are going to have to pay more for insurance. And if you look over the past year, insurance costs here in Australia have soared. They really have, and they're contributing to overall inflation in an outsized way. Insurance shouldn't be that big of an impost on everyone's sort of annual spending, but it's really having a lot more than it should, which means inflation is higher than it should. And it's going to keep happening. It's not like insurance companies are going to go in 5 years, go, oh, well, phew, that risk is over. We can drop down our insurance premiums. No, they're going to keep going up. And it's going to get to the point, not only are they so expensive, but there's going to be massive areas in Australia and around the world that just become uninsurable.
Yep.
And that's going to be a cost because not only does that sort of narrow the pool of who's been insured, and so generally insurance go up, but governments are also going to have to decide, okay, does that mean the public now have to kind of insure them? What happens there? All of these questions that the governments, again, no one's sort of addressing, no one is facing up to this. It's all this, oh no, you'll still be able to live there, even though that gets flooded with a once in a century flood every 2 years. All of these questions are not being asked and not being answered. And they're not going away.
Yeah. So in the face of all of this, Greg, I know it's really not your forte, but is there any hope that you can give to the listeners? What can the listeners actually do?
Well, look, I mean, one, if you're brave enough to protest, I tip my hat to you. It really is a brave thing to do, and I have all respect to you. But think about your vote. As I say, the 2022 election, people decided that these once extremely safe Liberal seats, sorry, we're not going to vote for a party that doesn't take this seriously. And while we here at the Australian Institute are completely nonpartisan, we really don't care who you vote for. I don't care who you vote for. But just think of it this way. We do have a preferential voting system. Even if you think that Labor is better than Liberal, even if you think Liberal is better than Labor, you don't have to vote Labor or Liberal 1. You can vote them 2. And that is a crucial thing because under our system of elections, the funding that political parties and politicians get from elections comes through that number 1, that first preference. If you vote for a political party, if you give them their first vote, you're in a sense giving them $3.39 for that first preference. That goes into all their funding. And if you times that by millions, that's a lot of money. Think about and look at what these political parties and politicians, whether they're independents or not, look at what they're offering. And if you care about climate change, give your first vote to the person who you think is most serious about it. And, talk about this with your families. I know, which is always a wonderful thing of climate, all your friends, but, really value that vote. I think that is the most important thing. I love our preferential voting system. I think it's so much better than what America has, what the UK has with first party.
American election has really made me value the Australian electoral system.
But it's also a case of we need to value that. Richard Dennis has said many times over the past year or so, there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. Treat your vote with care and value and vote for the candidate who actually delivers, who is promising something that actually might have an impact on emissions, and don't just reward indolence and lies from the major parties. Say, okay, you might get my preference before the other, but you're not getting my $3.89. You know, you're going to have to earn that.
All right. Well, on that note, I guess we should probably end it there. Thank you
fire
for
up, people.
Ranting a bit more today with me, Craig.
No worries, Elinor. And once again, great to be back for another big year. It is going to be a big year. A lot of our talk is going to be about the election, but there'll also be a lot of stuff about the economy. And we'll be back again next week with another dollars and cents. And I think inflation and interest rates might be rearing their head again. But this episode of Dollars and Cents was recorded on Thursday, the 16th of January. And some things may have changed. Do we think policy on climate change will have changed by the time? Look,
fingers crossed.
There might be a big announcement that Labor is going to ban new coal mines. That would be really nice.
That would be nice.
Just throwing that out into the ether. You can read more of my rant on this issue on the Guardian Australia site. And for all of our research on climate change policy, on the way in which fossil fuel companies are absolutely taking us for a ride, go to our website, which is australiainstitute.org.au. My Blue Sky handle and the handle I use on all social media is @GrogsGamut, and Elinor's is, I've got no idea what it is.
It's just Elinor.Johnstonleak.
Elinor.Johnstonleak at Blue Sky. Come along and have a chat, and please pepper us with any questions about things you'd want us to talk about. Music, as always, is by Blue Dot Sessions. Everyone, have a great week, and we'll catch you all next week.
See ya.